Welcome to the character lesson on Banquo. So, our lesson is going to be about having a look at, firstly, how Banquo is important to the play and different ways to analyze his character and different ways to bring him into analysis of other themes or other characters as well. So, even if you don't get a Banquo focused question, you can still use him. And the same with Fleance. Even if you don't get a Fleance focused question, you can still use him too, even if you don't know how to pronounce his name, just like me. So, so I'm going to jump in with Banquo, who I'm happy pronouncing. I actually rescued a dog once that I called Banquo after this character, so I really like that name. It's a very odd name, isn't it? Very memorable, which is good for this type of thing. So we're going to look at Banquo's character then. So, firstly, feel free to write down anything I say or anything that's kind of noted here on the page. All of it's going to help you. Don't bother writing down stuff you already know. So it's always good when you're note taking to write down new things that you don't know or something that's really important that you're scared you're going to forget and you really want to remember it. So I recommend only jotting down those things so that you're quite selective about what you write versus what you're listening to. And yeah, we're going to jump into Banquo's character now. So he's Macbeth's long term friend. They've been friends a long time. They've known each other really well for a long time. They seem like they are the two most kind of friendly characters in the whole world of Macbeth. So they're friends and they're also allies. Ally means that they are on the same side in battle. And Banquo is a general in the king's army, which is just like Macbeth. So he's a war general. He's slightly always talked about in an inferior way to Macbeth. When other people talk about them together, they always talk about Macbeth did this thing first and then Banquo kind of came after. So maybe his position is slightly less than Macbeth in terms of how well people think of him. But whether he's physically or kind of occupationally inferior, so in work or kind of in how good he is at his job, he might be slightly inferior. He's got the moral high ground, so he's morally superior. He's a lot better than Macbeth in terms of how strong his character is, what his sense of good is versus evil, and his kind of nature is more tended towards the good side than the evil side. So Macbeth has both elements in his character as well, and part of the interesting thing about the play is he debates those, so he goes back and forth, and he's not just pure evil from the beginning, because that wouldn't be so interesting. But he becomes more and more evil as the play progresses, whereas Banquo remains morally good. So he mistrusts the witches and he doesn't fixate on their prophecies. So he gets a prophecy the same as Macbeth, but he's not consumed by it. He's not delivering a million soliloquies on stage by it. He's not thinking about it and, having visions of it and that kind of thing, whereas Macbeth is. So his mind, Banquo's mind, is not tempted by evil, whereas Macbeth is. So you can see how even if you're doing an essay on Macbeth, you can start to weave in Banquo as a comparative character, as one that is similar in some ways but acts differently from Macbeth as well. Or if you're doing an essay about the witches or about evil, you can equally use Banquo in these types of points. So, thirdly, he has thoughts of ambition. This is really important. It's not like he just doesn't care and doesn't want to be any better than he is. Macduff actually is like that. He's kind of happy with his position in life. He's really confident with his status and his wife and his child. So he doesn't really need any more power, any more money or status than he already has. But Banquo is slightly interested in that idea. So he's not like completely averse to the idea of being more powerful than he is currently. So he has the potential for corruption, the same as Macbeth, whereas Macduff doesn't. He's like a pure good hero kind of figure. And I've got a lesson that I do on Macduff, Lady Macduff, and I can't remember who else, Ross. So you can have a look at that character lesson if you're interested in those as well. Yeah, so Banquo, he says, "Speak then to me." So the witches give this giant speech to Macbeth about everything great that he's going to be. And Banquo sort of says, "Speak then to me." And it depends on how the director chooses to deliver this line. So a director always has control over the tone of the lines and the way that the actors interpret them. So he could be saying it in a kind of defiant way, like, "Oh, I don't believe you. I'm going to test you out with your prophecies. What are you going to say about me then?" So he could say it in quite a defiant way, but he could also deliver that in a bit of a jealous way, like, "Hang on, you've given Macbeth all these things about his future. You've not said anything about me." So you could interpret his character as quite ambitious, as a little bit jealous of Macbeth's slightly superior status, but as much better in nature ultimately when push comes to shove. So it's down to our interpretation of character, which is an important thing to talk about in essays. You don't always want to be straightforward because you'll never get those really top levels by just saying that this is exactly how it is. You always have to go into different angles, different ways we could think about things. So, with that in mind, I've actually built a couple more arguments now that we're going to look at. So, one argument is that even though he dies, his descendants become king. So, in a way, he in the long term is more successful than Macbeth. So maybe short-term success, he's dead himself, Macbeth becomes king. It doesn't really seem like Banquo gets the better deal. But when you look at it over a longer time period, Banquo's family is the one that ends up in power, and his bloodline is the one that is on the throne. And Macbeth is only on the throne for a very short space of time. He's killed, he has no one to follow him. So Banquo kind of wins if you look at it from that perspective. So that's a really interesting tension that you can explore in essays that will get you a lot of kind of deep ideas and deep analysis into the points about who sort of suffers more or who wins, or what is the message of the play. So maybe from that, Shakespeare's message is something like, even if good loses short term, it's going to win long term, and evil might seem powerful, but it's very brief, and you have to sacrifice too much to gain that power. So it's not worth it. So you can see how underneath we've got this message about morality, about what we were talking about here, about the kind of good versus evil type thing. So I really like this, and I always use this because it's really important when you're writing essays to not only use the language that the characters speak, you want to also use stage directions. So it might seem kind of weird because the stage direction is just a note to the director about how the scene should look. But because it's a play and it's meant to be performed, and we're not technically really supposed to sit there and read it, you want to talk about stage directions and how that is helping the director to understand the kind of space of the scene, or the physicality of the scene, or the interaction between the characters, all of that kind of stuff. And that gets you really super top marks at GCSE and A level, and also university level. So you want to make sure that you're confident talking about the performance aspects of the play. How is it actually going to be performed? Because it makes it feel like a real live living thing rather than just a kind of flat piece of paper. So, with that in mind, we have this stage direction: enter the ghost of Banquo and sits in Macbeth's place. So basically, Banquo is dead, but his ghost appears. This is at the feast in, um, I'll write that in actually, I think it's Act 3, Scene 4, so 3.4, which is the banquet scene, right in the middle of the play. It's really important to get that drummed into your head, kind of like how it's drummed in mine. So in the middle of the play, there's this kind of tipping point of the banquet where Macbeth's supposed to be celebrating being king, and it's meant to be a happy occasion, and he actually goes really mad, and Lady Macbeth has to call the whole feast off and tell everyone to go home because Macbeth's not well. So the inciting incident, the thing that causes him not to be well, is that he sees a ghost sitting on the throne where he should be sitting himself, and he freaks out about this. And it creates dramatic irony, which is a really important technique that you need to be able to analyze, where the audience knows something that the other characters don't. So Macbeth can see this ghost, we can see this ghost, no one else can see this ghost. So everyone thinks Macbeth's gone mad, basically. So it can be kind of funny, or it can be quite frightening. Again, it depends on performance. But we have this idea of physicality, that even though Banquo's body is dead, his soul is tormenting Macbeth, or the guilt of Macbeth's kind of, turning on his best friend and sending murderers sneakily in the night to kill his friend and his son. That is plaguing Macbeth's mind. And it kind of doesn't even matter if that ghost is a real physical ghost, or if that ghost is just a vision that Macbeth's got because he's going mad, because it all has the same effect at the end of the day, to drive Macbeth into a more fragile state of mind, to expose his weaknesses, to show now that he's gained power, absolute power of being a king, he's not able to maintain that power because he's too weak and he's too susceptible to evil. He's very frightened by this ghost, despite the fact that the ghost doesn't actually do anything to him. And there's tons you can analyze about that. So you can say he's still a presence in the play, he's haunting Macbeth. You could talk about magic and the supernatural. Maybe the witches send it as an apparition. Maybe it's completely psychological and it's totally in his mind. How we interpret this play is going to depend on the audience at the time and how their beliefs are set. So a modern day audience might be more interested in the psychology, and maybe see it as some kind of hallucination or vision, whereas a contemporary audience in Shakespeare's day might have interpreted it more as kind of magic and evil, and something put there by the witches. So it depends on what your cultural beliefs are, and what you personally are interested in, and also generally what people would have believed at a certain point in time when they're watching this play. And again, that's a way to get those really high grades when you're writing your essay, to look at those differences of interpretation. It kind of reminds Macbeth as well that he's failed to kill Fleance, and that Fleance might come back and get revenge anytime. We'll look at that when we look at Fleance in a minute. And it reminds him of that prediction that the witches had, that they didn't only predict good stuff for Macbeth, they did kind of predict good stuff for Banquo as well. So it's a bit like a kick in the teeth for Macbeth. You can start to bring in critical ideas if you're aiming for like super top level, like 8 or 9 at GCSE, or you're doing it A level and above. If you're doing A level and above, actually be really confident with critics and make sure you have loads of quotes and so on. So I've got other lessons in the Scribbly courses that teach you how to do that if you're interested. So a lot of critics say that Banquo is a foil to Macbeth. Foil is a really important form/structure word. So again, it allows you to do your form structure analysis in detail. It means a character that expresses similar personality or similar aspects, but then also very different aspects to the main character. So as I was saying at the beginning of this Banquo type lesson thing that I'm doing now, it's not really a lesson, it's more just like an analysis. I was saying at the beginning that he's like so similar to Macbeth in these ways, but he's really different in those ways. That makes him a foil. So we use this word foil, and make sure that you're happy and confident using that word. Look up more about how to use that word if you're not sure about it. So he exposes Macbeth's weaknesses by being a better person, because we can directly compare and contrast how Banquo reacts to the witches to how Macbeth reacts to the witches. So that's a really important function of Banquo as a supporting character, and it's really significant. So you definitely want to mention that if you're doing an essay about him. Next one is a contextual point. So King James was thought to be related to Banquo, which I think is kind of interesting. King James is the king who's just been made king at the time. He was already king of Scotland, and then he became king of England. I've got loads of context on that if you look at the Macbeth context aspects of the Scribbly Macbeth course. So basically, King James is the audience. He's like the main guy that Shakespeare's writing for at the time, and he's trying to convince other people that King James is a good king, which is one of the messages of the play. And he was thought to be related to Banquo. So there's this kind of crossover between history and reality and fiction and story, and it's really interesting because Shakespeare takes all these elements from reality and he sort of kind of sprinkles them into his play and mixes them with unreal bits and so on, which is one of the reasons why his plays are so interesting, because they feel really real, because they are based on real events and real characters a lot of the time. So in this case, the person who's watching this play is actually related to one of the characters, and this character meets a sorry end, but he's a very good character throughout, and he's seen as a noble, honourable man who doesn't give in to evil. So it's kind of like a compliment to King James that he didn't happen to be related to Macbeth, he happened to be related to Banquo. So Banquo is presented in a positive light, partly just as a foil, but also partly because he's importantly connected to King James. But that doesn't mean that everyone thinks he's perfect. So some people, some critics, some interpreters of the play also think of Banquo as imperfect. So again, we're getting in that kind of different angles of argument, different layered interpretations in there. He is a good character, but he's not that active. He's quite passive. Like he says, I fear thou playedst most foully for it, when he's thinking about how Macbeth won the throne. Like you didn't win the throne fairly. But he doesn't actually do anything to stop him, nor does he tell anyone who might be able to do something. He doesn't like go to Malcolm and say, "Hey Malcolm, I think Macbeth killed your dad." I guess Malcolm runs away pretty quickly, doesn't he? So he doesn't quite have time. But he could speak to Macduff, he could speak to Lennox or Ross or, loads of different characters that he could turn to, and he doesn't turn to anyone. He sort of keeps it to himself. So either he's weak or he's naive, or he kind of only half distrusts Macbeth and he really wants to believe that he's still a good man and he's still his best friend and so on. There's loads of different possible reasons there, but it means that he's not a perfect character, and you have to kind of like understand that as well when you're analysing the play. There's things he could have done that he didn't do, things he could have acted on to change the outcome. So the play is totally focused around Macbeth, and Macbeth is the tragic hero, so he's the main thing that we're supposed to analyse. But you can see how bringing in Banquo or contrasting him with Banquo is going to get you some extra depth of analysis, and it's going to help you kind of explore these characters on a deeper level.